Hi everyone, welcome back. In this lecture, we'll create a Spring Boot REST API that handles HTTP POST request. For example, consider we are using Postman REST client as a client to make the REST API call. And whenever client make a HTTP POST request, then client have to send a data in a request body. For example, consider this is the post HTTP request and it contains a JSON student object in the request body. And in this lecture, we are going to write a Spring Boot REST API that handles this kind of HTTP post request and extract this kind of JSON from the HTTP request. Alright, so let's go ahead and let's write the Spring Boot REST API that will handle this kind of HTTP post request and extract the JSON data from the request body. So let me go to IntelliJ IDEA over here and here go to student controller and here let me first write the comment. Let's say Spring Boot REST API that handles HTTP post request. Well, in order to create a Spring Boot REST API that handles HTTP post request, we are going to use two important annotation. One is @post mapping annotation and second one is @request body annotation. Well, we'll see what is the use of these two annotations a bit later. Now let's go and let's first create a Spring Boot REST API that handles HTTP post request. Well, as usual, we'll first create a Java method and then we'll make that Java method as a Spring Boot REST API by using Spring annotations. Well, here let me type the method public and let's give return type as a student. Next, let's give method name as create student. Next, let's pass student as a method argument. Perfect. And within the create student method, we are going to print the student data. So here let me put the sys out and then let's print student dot get ID. Similarly, let's print student first name and last name. So here student dot get first name and then student dot get last name. Perfect. Here we are basically just checking whether our REST API will get the student object from the HTTP request or not. Okay, for that here we just printed the student information to the console and after that we just return the student to the client. Now we have created create student method that returns the same incoming student. Next, let's make this create student method as a REST API by using @post mapping annotation. So let's go ahead and let's annotate this method with @post mapping annotation. Well, here we are using @post mapping annotation to map incoming HTTP post request to this method. Alright, next let's go and let's configure the URL for this method. Well, here let's go URL something like students/create. So this REST API will basically create a new resource, hence we are using this URL students/create. Okay, next let's go and let's use one more important annotation, that is @request body annotation. Well, @request body annotation is responsible to retrieve a JSON object from the HTTP request and it will automatically convert that JSON object into Java object. In our case, student is the Java object. Okay, for example, if you look at the Postman REST client over here, Postman REST client will basically send a HTTP post request. It contains a JSON in a request body and now we are using @request body annotation. It will convert this JSON into Java object. Okay, well, @request body annotation, it internally uses Spring provided HTTP message converters to convert a JSON into Java object. Alright, I hope you understood the usage of @post mapping annotation as well as @request body annotation. We use @post mapping annotation to map incoming HTTP post request to this method. @request body annotation is responsible to retrieve a JSON from the request body and it will automatically convert that JSON into Java object. And @request body annotation, it internally uses Spring provided HTTP message converters to automatically convert a JSON into Java object. Alright, perfect. Now let's go ahead and let's run our Spring Boot application and let's see how this REST API works. So let me stop the existing server and let me start the Spring Boot application. Well, our Spring Boot application is up and running. Next, let's open Postman REST client and let us test this REST API. Well, here I have opened the Postman REST client and I am going to create a new request. So in order to create a new request, go ahead and click on this plus icon over here and here just choose HTTP post request and here just enter the URL http colon localhost colon 8080 slash students slash create. Well, here students slash create. So this is the URL we have given to the REST API. For example, if you go to IntelliJ IDEA and go to our REST API, here you can see we have given the URL students slash create. So this is the URL we are using over here. Next, this is the post request. So we have to pass a JSON in the body. For that, go to body and then choose raw here. And here we need to choose the content type as a JSON. So go ahead and choose JSON. And in a request body, we need to pass the student JSON object. So here let's create the JSON. So student has ID. So ID and then value, let's give 3. And then student first name. Let's give Vikram. And let's give last name. Let's say Jadhav. Well, in our project, we are mapping this JSON to Java object, right? For example, if you go to our project, you can see here we have student model class. It has a ID, first name, last name. Okay. So whenever a client sends a JSON in a request body, that JSON we are basically binding to this student object, isn't it? That's why the student fields and JSON attributes should be same. Okay. So whenever you send a JSON in a request body, make sure that the attributes of the JSON and the fields of the model class should be same. Alright, great. Next, let's go and let's hit the send button. And if you can notice here, client got the response, that is the student object. Our REST API returned the same student object. That's why client got the same student object in the response. And notice here the HTTP status, that is 200 OK. Well, if our REST API don't return any HTTP status, then by default Spring Boot will send HTTP status as a 200. But here we have created the REST API that create the new resource. Hence, this REST API should return HTTP status code 201 created. Well, in order to send HTTP status in a response, we can use @response status annotation. For example, if you can see here, we are using @response status annotation to send a status in the response. So just choose @response status annotation and just pass a status code. For example, here I am going to pass HTTP status.created. Okay, just remember, whenever you create a REST API that handles HTTP post request, then your REST API should return a status code 201 created. Okay, great. Well, we can also use response entity class to create the response for the REST API. Okay, we'll see in upcoming lectures how we can use response entity class to create a response for the REST API. Well, there are different ways to create a response for the REST API. In this lecture, we are using @response status annotation to return HTTP status to the client. But in upcoming lectures, we will see how we can use response entity class to create a response for the REST API. Okay, great. Now let me run the Spring Boot application and let's see how this REST API works now. Well, let me go to Postman client and let me send the request again. And there we go. You can able to see here HTTP status 201 created. Well, remember, whenever you create a Spring Boot REST API that handles HTTP post request, then your REST API should return a status code 201 created. Okay, and you have to use @post mapping annotation to map incoming HTTP post request to this method, and you have to use @request body annotation to extract a JSON from the HTTP request and convert a JSON into Java object. Well, in real-time project, this REST API have to save this student object into database. But for this example, we have printed this student object into a console. For example, you can see student ID, first name and last name. Okay, but in real-time project, make sure that you save this student object into database and return that saved student object to the client. Alright, great. I hope you understood how to create a Spring Boot REST API that handles HTTP post request to create a new resource. In next lecture, we will see how to create a Spring Boot REST API that handles HTTP put request. Alright, great. I will see you in the next lecture.